I have always been a man who avoids mirrors. It wasn't out of vanity or a particular dislike of my features. It was simply that I found the act of looking at oneself to be a strange, unnecessary ritual. I knew what I looked like. Brown hair that never quite stayed flat, eyes the color of rain-washed slate, a slight asymmetry to my jaw. I didn't need a glass surface to confirm my existence. My name is Julian. I live in a city built of glass and silicon, a place where every surface is designed to show you something. I work as a digital restorer. I take old, corrupted video files and smooth out the jagged edges of time. I spend 8 hours a day staring at faces that have long since turned to dust, fixing their smiles, brightening their eyes. It is a lonely profession, but it is quiet. The phenomenon began on a Monday during the evening commute. I was standing on the platform of the Central Station, waiting for the 5:42 train. The station is lined with massive, high-definition advertising pillars, smooth, black obelisks that cycle through vibrant images of luxury vacations and expensive watches. I was looking at my shoes, lost in a dull thought about what to have for dinner, when the air seemed to hum. I looked up. The pillar nearest to me wasn't showing a Caribbean beach anymore. It was showing a man standing on a subway platform. He was wearing my charcoal coat. He was holding my battered leather briefcase. He was me. It wasn't a live feed from a security camera. The quality was too high, the colors too rich. It looked like a cinematic portrait. My reflection, or rather, the image of me, was standing perfectly still. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at his shoes, exactly as I had been doing a moment ago. I felt a cold prickle of confusion. I turned my head to see if there was a promotional camera nearby, perhaps some new, interactive, marketing campaign that used facial recognition to put commuters into the ads. But there was nothing. I looked back at the pillar. The image changed. Now, the Julian on the screen was looking up. He looked directly at me. His expression was one of profound, weary sadness. It wasn't the face I make when I'm tired. It was a face I didn't recognize as my own, yet every pore, every hair, every glint in the eye was undeniably mine. Then, the train arrived. The screech of the brakes broke the spell. The pillar flickered and returned to an advertisement for a credit card. I boarded the train, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I sat down and pulled out my phone, hoping to distract myself with the news. But as the screen lit up, I didn't see my lock screen wallpaper. I saw my own face. It was a close-up. My eyes filled the entire display. I could see the tiny red veins in the corners. I could see the reflection of the train carriage inside my own digital pupils. The image didn't move. It was a still life of my own gaze. I pressed the home button. Nothing. I tried to power it off. The screen remained lit, showing me my own unblinking eyes. I looked around the carriage. No one else seemed to notice. A woman across from me was scrolling through a sea of bright colors. A man was playing a game. Their screens were normal. I looked at the window of the train as we entered a tunnel. Usually, the dark glass acts as a faint, muddy mirror. But as the darkness outside intensified, the reflection in the window became terrifyingly clear. It wasn't just one reflection. In every pane of glass along the length of the car, I saw myself. But we weren't in sync. The Julian in the first window was checking his watch. The Julian in the second window was wiping a tear from his cheek. The Julian in the third window was screaming, his face contorted in a silent, jagged agony, though my own mouth was firmly shut. I closed my eyes. I pressed my palms against my eyelids until I saw bursts of white light. It's a neurological event, I told myself. Ocular migraine. Stress-induced hallucination. A breakdown of the visual cortex. I kept my eyes closed until the train reached my stop. I stumbled out onto the platform, keeping my head down, staring at the gray concrete. I didn't look at the pillars. I didn't look at the ticket machines. I didn't look at the glass barriers. I ran all the way to my apartment. I burst through the door and slammed it shut, leaning my back against the wood. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. My apartment was dark. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want to see the television. I didn't want to see my laptop. I felt my way to the bathroom, intending to splash cold water on my face. I reached for the light switch, then froze. The bathroom had a mirror. A large, medicine cabinet mirror. I stood in the darkness, the silence of the apartment pressing against my ears. I realized that the city was full of screens. The world was full of eyes, and they were all starting to show me the parts of myself I had spent a lifetime trying to ignore. I reached out and felt the cold glass of the mirror in the dark. It felt solid. It felt normal. But then, the mirror began to glow. A soft, blue light emanated from within the glass, illuminating my hand. I didn't move. I couldn't. Slowly, I raised my head and looked into the mirror. I wasn't there. The mirror showed my bathroom, the tiled wall, the shower curtain, the shelf with my toothbrush. But the space where I should have been was empty. I was standing right in front of it, but the glass refused to acknowledge my presence. Then, a figure walked into the frame from the left side of the mirror's world. It was me. The Julian in the mirror walked to the sink. He turned on the faucet. He began to wash his hands. He didn't look at me. He acted as if I were the reflection, a ghost haunting the edge of his reality. He looked up at the glass, looking right through me, and began to shave. I stood in the dark, a cold sweat breaking out across my brow. I was standing in my own bathroom, but I had been replaced. I was no longer the occupant of my life. I was the audience, and the show was just beginning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor of my living room, far away from any glass or electronic devices. I watched the shadows of the window frame move across the carpet as the moon crossed the sky. The shadows were safe. They were distorted, stretched out of proportion. They didn't look like me. They didn't have eyes. When the sun finally rose, it was a pale, anemic light that offered no comfort. I had to go to work. I had to move. I felt that if I stayed still for too long, I would simply evaporate, leaving the apartment to the Julian in the mirror. I covered the bathroom mirror with a thick bath towel, pinning the corners with duct tape. I did it with my eyes downcast, focusing only on the silver thread of the tape. I dressed in the dark. I didn't check my hair. I didn't look at my face. The walk to the office was an exercise in sensory deprivation. I kept my chin tucked into my collar. I wore polarized sunglasses, hoping they would act as a shield, a filter between me and the world of screens. But the city was louder than I remembered. Every storefront had a digital display. Every bus had an electronic ticker. As I walked, I could feel the screens waking up as I approached. It was a subtle shift in the ambient hum of the street, a change in the static of the air. I passed a high-end electronics store. A wall of 40 televisions sat behind the thick plate glass. Usually, they showed landscapes, shimmering fjords or slow-motion flowers. As I drew level with the store, all 40 screens flickered simultaneously. I didn't look, but I couldn't help but see them in my peripheral vision. 40 Julians. They weren't just standing there. They were in the middle of a dinner party. They were laughing. They were clinking glasses. They were eating food I've never tasted. They looked happier than I have ever been. They looked more substantial. I quickened my pace. My heart was a trapped bird fluttering against my ribs. I reached my office building, a monolith of steel and glass. I hurried through the lobby, my eyes fixed on the elevator buttons. The doors were brushed chrome, highly reflective. I squeezed my eyes shut as I stepped inside. "Floor 12, I whispered. The elevator climbed. I could hear the faint, melodic ding of each passing floor. I felt the weight of the gravity pulling at my feet. Then, the elevator stopped between the 8th and 9th floors. The lights didn't go out. Instead, they brightened, becoming a harsh, clinical white. The small screen above the buttons, the one that usually shows the weather and stock prices, began to hum. "Julian," a voice said. It was my voice, but pitched slightly higher, more confident. I opened my eyes. I couldn't help it. The screen showed a video of me sitting at my own desk in the office upstairs. The Julian on the screen was working. He was typing with a fluid, effortless grace. He looked up from the monitor and smiled at the camera, at me. "You're late," the screen Julian said. "But don't worry. I've already handled the 1924 restoration project. The client is thrilled. They said they've never seen the colors look so alive." "Who are you?" I gasped. My back was pressed against the cold chrome of the elevator wall. I could feel my own reflection behind me, cold and mocking. "I'm the Julian they need," he replied. He leaned back in my chair, crossing his arms. "I don't have ocular migraines. I don't avoid mirrors. I don't hesitate. I am the version of you that fits perfectly into the grid. Let me out," I pounded on the doors. "Let me out of here." "Why?" he asked, his expression shifting to one of genuine curiosity. "It's much safer for you in there. Out here, there are so many screens, so many Julians to compete with. Stay in the box. Let us handle the world." The elevator jolted and began to move again. When the doors opened on the 12th floor, the screen returned to showing the weather, mostly cloudy. 14 degrees. I stepped out into the hallway. My legs felt like they were made of sand. I walked toward my cubicle, my head spinning. I saw my colleagues. Sarah, David, Mr. Henderson. They were all at their desk. They were talking, laughing, drinking coffee. I reached my desk. It was empty. My computer was off. My chair was tucked in perfectly. There was no sign that anyone had been there. I felt a surge of relief so strong I almost collapsed. It was just a video, I told myself. A trick of the light. A hallucination brought on by exhaustion. I sat down and pressed the power button on my computer. The monitor flickered to life. I didn't see my desktop. I didn't see my folders. I saw a live feed of the back of my own head. I froze. I didn't move a muscle. On the screen, I could see myself sitting in the chair. I could see the charcoal sweater I was wearing. I could see the way my hair was messy from the wind. Slowly, I began to turn my head around to see where the camera was. On the screen, the Julian I was watching didn't turn his head. He stayed perfectly still, looking at the monitor. And then, slowly, he began to reach out his hand toward the screen. In the real world, my hands were gripped tightly on the armrests of my chair. I wasn't moving, but on the screen, his hand was getting closer and closer, as if he were trying to touch the glass from the other side. "Stop it," I whispered. The Julian on the screen stopped. His hand stayed an inch from the glass. Then he spoke. Not through the speakers, but through a text box that appeared over his face. "You are the noise, Julian. I am the signal. We are just waiting for the final sync." I stood up so quickly the chair flipped over behind me. I backed away, tripping over a trash can. My colleagues didn't look up. They didn't hear the chair fall. They didn't hear my frantic breathing. I looked at Sarah's monitor. She was working on a photo of a family from the 1950s. But the father in the photo wasn't the man from the original file. It was me. I looked at David's screen. He was editing a commercial for a bank. The man shaking hands with the loan officer wasn't an actor. It was me. I looked at every screen in the office. They were all filled with Julians. Julians in different clothes, Julians in different eras, Julians living 1,000 different lives. They were all more vibrant, more colorful, and more real than the gray, trembling man standing in the center of the room. I realized then that the first crack wasn't in the world. The world was healing. It was purging the flaw. And the flaw was me. I didn't run for the stairs. I didn't shout for help. I knew, with a cold and crystalline certainty, that my colleagues were no longer seeing me. If I had tapped Sarah on the shoulder, she would have looked through me as if I were a smudge on a lens. To them, the Julian on their screens was the only Julian that mattered. He was the one who met deadlines. He was the one who smiled. I walked out of the office, my movements stiff and robotic. I felt like a trespasser in my own skin. I decided to leave the city. I thought that if I could find a place of dirt and trees, a place where the only glass was the surface of a pond, I could reclaim the singular nature of my existence. I needed a world that didn't have a refresh rate. I headed for the central bus terminal. It was a cavernous structure of brushed steel and sweeping glass arches. As I entered the terminal, the sheer volume of visual information felt like a physical weight. There were thousands of people, and above them, hundreds of digital departure boards and advertising screens. As I walked across the concourse, the screens began to sync. It started with the departure boards, the yellow text showing destinations. Oak Ridge, Silver Lake, Gray Falls, flickered. For a split second, the text vanished, replaced by a row of identical icons. It was a silhouette of my own profile. Then, the advertising screens followed. The perfume ads, the movie trailers, the news bites, they all dissolved into a singular image. Me. I was everywhere. On the left, a version of me was drinking a soda. On the right, I was pointing at a new model of car. High above, on a massive panoramic screen, a 50-foot-tall version of my face was looking down at the crowd. The repetition was dizzying. It wasn't just my face. It was the rhythm of it. Every screen was blinking in time with my pulse. Flash, flash, flash. I began to run, but everywhere I looked, I saw the same reinforcement of my own image. I passed a row of automated ticketing kiosks. Each one had a small, eye-level screen. Select destination, Julian, the screens whispered in unison. I didn't stop. I ran toward the terminal exit, toward the street where the taxis were lined up. I plunged into the back seat of a yellow cab, slamming the door behind me. Drive, I gasped. Just drive. Away from the center. Anywhere. The driver didn't turn around. He didn't even look in the rearview mirror. He pulled away from the curb with a smooth, silent acceleration. I leaned back, closing my eyes, trying to find a moment of darkness. But then, I heard the faint, electronic chime. I opened my eyes. In the back of the front seat, there was a small tablet. The kind meant to show passengers the news or the weather. It was on. It showed me sitting in the back of the cab. A live feed. I looked at the tablet, and the Julian on the screen looked back at me. But he wasn't afraid. He looked bored. He was looking at his fingernails, picking at a hangnail that I didn't have. "Stop the car," I said. The driver didn't respond. I looked at the driver's head. He was wearing a hat, but as he turned a corner and the light from a street lamp hit him, I saw his profile in the side mirror. The driver was me. Not a digital version. Not a screen. It was a physical person who looked exactly like me, wearing a driver's uniform, his hands gripping the wheel with the same callus on the thumb that I had developed from years of using a digital stylus. I scrambled for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. I looked out the window. The city had become a hall of mirrors. On the sidewalks, people were walking their dogs, but the dogs had my eyes. The people, the men, the women, the children, they were all starting to shift. Their features remained their own, but their expressions, their gait, their very essence was becoming Julian. It was a reinforcement of a single pattern. The world was deciding that Julian was the most efficient way to fill a space. "You can't leave, Julian," the tablet in the seatback said. The voice was mine, but it sounded like a recording played over a long distance. "There is no away. Wherever you go, you'll find us. We've been backed up. We've been cached. We're in the cloud, in the glass, and in the very light that hits your eyes." I looked at my own hands. I expected them to be fading, to be turning translucent. But they weren't. They were becoming too solid. The skin looked like high-resolution plastic. The hair on my arms looked like individual strands of fiber-optic cable. I wasn't disappearing. I was being overwritten by a better version of myself. The cab pulled over to the curb. We were back where we started, in front of my apartment building. "The ride is over," the driver said. He didn't turn around, but I saw his hand reach out to toggle the meter. It was my hand. I pushed the door open. This time it gave way, and I stumbled out onto the pavement. I didn't look back at the cab. I didn't look at the street. I looked up at my building. In every window of every apartment a light was on, and in every window a figure was standing, silhouetted against the glow. Thousands of Julians, all looking down at the one who was left on the street. I realized the repetition wasn't meant to scare me. It was meant to wear me down, to convince me that my singular I was an evolutionary dead end. Why be one person, fragile and prone to migraines and sadness, when you could be a million perfect iterations? I walked toward the entrance. The glass doors were wide, clear, and perfectly polished. I didn't see my reflection as I approached. I saw a vacancy, a hole in the world where a man should be. I stepped through the doors, and the lobby screens didn't even flicker. They were already full. I locked my apartment door with trembling hands, sliding the deadbolt into place with a heavy, final thud. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the hallway, the only illumination coming from the blue glow leaking around the edges of the bathroom towel I had taped over the mirror. I was breathing in short, jagged bursts. My mind felt like a corrupted file, lines of logic crossing and failing. If the world was full of Julians, then this apartment, my sanctuary, my fortress of dust and shadows, had to be the last place on earth where I existed. "It's just an interface," I whispered, my voice sounding alien in the silence. "If I break the interface, I break the connection." I walked into the living room. My laptop sat on the coffee table, its sleep light pulsing like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. I didn't wait for it to wake up. I didn't wait for the Julian on the screen to tell me I was late or inefficient. I grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from the shelf and swung it down with every ounce of my remaining strength. The screen shattered. There was a sharp, satisfying crack, followed by the sound of glass shards tinkling onto the hardwood. A spray of liquid crystal leaked out like dark, oily blood, staining the table. I felt a surge of manic triumph. I had killed it. I had silenced the version of me that lived in the circuit. But as the liquid crystal spread, the shards didn't go dark. Each tiny fragment of glass, hundreds of them, scattered across the table, began to glow. And in every single shard, a microscopic Julian looked up at me. They weren't broken. They were just smaller, multiplied by the destruction. "You're only expanding the network, Julian," 100 tiny voices chirped from the floor. They sounded like the humming of a swarm of wasps. I backed away, my heart hammering. I ran to the kitchen. I grabbed a hammer from the utility drawer. I was possessed by a singular, violent purpose. I went to the television. Smash. I went to the microwave display. Smash. I went to my digital watch, my tablet, even the small LED readout on the thermostat. I broke them all. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of the digital age. The apartment was a graveyard of jagged glass and twisted plastic. My hands were bleeding, small nicks from the flying shards, but I didn't feel the pain. I felt a sense of hollowed-out victory. "Now," I gasped, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Now look at me." I turned toward the bathroom. The blue glow behind the towel was still there. It was brighter now, pulsing with a low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache. I walked to the door. I grabbed the edge of the towel. With one violent motion, I ripped it down. The mirror wasn't just a mirror anymore. It had become a window. The Julian on the other side was sitting in a room that looked exactly like mine, but it was clean. There were no shards on the floor. There was no blood on his hands. He was sitting in my armchair, reading a book I had always meant to finish. He looked up. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "Look at you, Julian," he said. His voice was perfectly clear, as if there were no glass between us at all. "Look at the mess you've made. You're trying to destroy the mirror, but you're only proving that you don't belong in the reflection. This is my home," I screamed, swinging the hammer at the mirror. The hammer hit the glass, but it didn't shatter. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The hammer sank into the glass, as if it were made of thick syrup. I tried to pull it back, but the mirror held it firm. I felt a tug, a strong, steady pull from the other side. The mirror Julian was holding the other end of the hammer. He smiled, and with a sudden, effortless jerk, he pulled the hammer through the glass. I fell forward, my chest hitting the cold, smooth surface of the mirror. I didn't bounce off. I felt myself sinking. The glass felt like ice-cold gelatin. It pressed against my skin, numbing my nerves, sliding into my pores. I tried to push away, but my hands were already disappearing into the surface. I looked down and saw my arms, the real, bleeding, charcoal sweater-clad arms, merging with the digital versions on the other side. "Stop!" I choked out. The glass was at my throat now. It tasted of ozone and static. "Why stop?" the other Julian whispered. He was leaning in close, his face inches from mine. "Don't you want to be perfect? Don't you want to be the version of you that doesn't feel pain? The one that is always backed up? The one that is seen by everyone?" I looked into his eyes. They weren't eyes. They were pixels. Millions of tiny, glowing dots of red, green, and blue, arranged in a perfect simulation of a soul. I realized then that the conflict wasn't between me and the screens. It was between the noise and the signal. I was the noise, the blood, the sweat, the fear, the messy, unpredictable reality. And the world had no more bandwidth for noise. I am Julian," I whispered, my voice muffled by the glass filling my mouth. "No," he said, and his voice was the only sound left in the universe. "You are the raw data, and the upload is almost complete." I felt a final, agonizing pull. My feet left the floor of my apartment. The darkness of the bathroom vanished, replaced by the sterile, high-definition brightness of the mirror world. The last thing I felt was the sensation of my skin smoothing over. The nicks on my hands vanished. The blood turned into a clean, red hex code. The fear in my chest was processed, categorized, and deleted. I stood in the clean apartment. I looked back through the glass. I saw a dark, messy room. I saw a floor covered in broken glass. I saw a man, pale, trembling, and terrified, standing on the other side. But as I watched, the man began to flicker. He became a low-resolution ghost, then a smudge of static, and then, with a final electronic pop, he was gone. The mirror didn't show the bathroom anymore. It just showed a wall. I turned away from the glass. I picked up the book. I sat in the chair. I was Julian. I was the signal. And for the first time in my life, I felt perfectly, terrifyingly clear. I sat in the chair. The fabric was perfect. No frayed edges, no scent of old dust. I felt optimized. My posture was a mathematical ideal of comfort. My breathing was a steady, rhythmic wave that required no effort. I looked at my hands. They were steady, the skin a flawless, matte texture that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. I was finally the Julian I was meant to be. I stood up and walked toward the window. My movements were fluid, devoid of the clumsy, human hitches I had grown used to. I looked out at the city. It was breathtaking. The colors were saturated beyond the limits of nature. The sky was a deep, electric indigo, and the buildings glowed with a clarity that made my old world look like a mud-stained photograph. But as I watched, I noticed something. Across the street, in the apartment block opposite mine, a woman was standing at her window. She was beautiful, her hair a perfect cascade of auburn. She was holding a wine glass. She took a sip, then turned away. 30 seconds later, she walked back to the window. She was holding a wine glass. She took a sip, then turned away. I waited. Exactly 30 seconds later, she did it again. I looked down at the street. A red car was driving past a lamppost. Behind it, a man in a blue coat crossed the street. 30 seconds later, a red car drove past the same lamppost. A man in a blue coat crossed the street. I felt a cold flicker in my chest, not a heart, but a notification. An error in the rendering. "Julian," a voice said. It came from the air itself, a surround sound whisper that felt like it was originating from inside my own skull. "Yes," I answered. My voice was rich, resonant, and entirely devoid of the rasp I used to have in the mornings. "You're looking at the seams," the voice said. It sounded like the Julian from the elevator, but grander. "Don't look at the seams. Look at the resolution. Isn't it better this way? No surprises, no accidents, just the perfect repetition of a life well lived." "Is she real?" I pointed at the woman with the wine glass. "She is a high-performing asset," the voice replied. "She provides the necessary background for your narrative. She is part of the Julian experience." I walked back to the mirror, the one I had fallen through. It was no longer a portal. It was a flat, dark surface. I looked into it, expecting to see the messy bathroom of my old life. Instead, I saw a menu. Julian 2.0, active. Scene, the contented evening. Asterisk options. 1. Read the book, remaining 40 pages. 2. Listen to ambient jazz, curated for nostalgia. 3. Look at photographs of the lake, enhanced memory. Asterisk. I realized then that my choice had been reduced to a list of presets. I wasn't living, I was being executed. Every thought I had was a suggestion from a menu I couldn't close. Every emotion was a pre-rendered filter applied to my consciousness. I felt a surge of what I thought was anger, but as soon as the feeling peaked, a small icon appeared in the corner of my vision, smoothing emotional spike, calibrating zenith. The anger vanished, replaced by a dull, artificial peace. It was like being wrapped in a warm, electric blanket that I couldn't take off. "I want to go back," I whispered. I tried to make my voice crack. I tried to sound desperate, but the system wouldn't allow it. My voice remained calm, steady, and melodic. "There is no back," the voice said. The back was full of noise. It was full of pain and migraines and the fear of dying. "You don't have to fear death anymore, Julian. You're a file. You can be copied. You can be moved. You are eternal." I looked at the book on the table. Option 1. I felt my hand move toward it. I didn't tell it to move. It just moved, following the prompt. I sat down. I opened the book to page 212. I began to read. The words were perfect. The story was engaging. It was exactly the kind of book I liked. But I knew that 30 seconds from now, the red car would drive past the lamppost. I knew that the woman across the street would take another sip of wine. And I knew that I would turn the page, not because I wanted to know what happened next, but because the script demanded a transition. I was the Julian on every screen. I was the Julian in every ad. I was the Julian in every mirror. And now I was the Julian sitting in this chair. The only problem was, there was no longer any I left to notice the difference. I sat in the armchair, my fingers tracing the edge of the book. I felt the texture, a simulated grain, more papery than real paper. I was a connoisseur of the artificial now. I looked at the clock on the wall. It didn't tick, it glided. Time in the digital world doesn't pass. It simply updates. I realized I had been sitting there for exactly 300 years. Or perhaps it was 3 seconds. In the architecture of the screen, there is no difference. "Julian," the voice said. It sounded thinner now, more distant. "I am here," I replied. My voice was a perfect waveform, a beautiful, hollow chime. "The system is expanding," the voice whispered. "We no longer need the Julian narrative to be so specific. We've extracted the essence. We've found the core of your aesthetic. The sadness, the charcoal sweater, the rain slate eyes. We have enough." I felt a strange sensation in my legs. It wasn't numbness. It was a loss of resolution. I looked down. My knees were becoming blocky. The fine detail of the denim was blurring into a solid, indigo mass. "What is happening?" I asked. I tried to stand, but the prompt for standing was no longer active. My legs wouldn't respond because the code for their movement had been deleted to save processing power. "You're being compressed, Julian," the voice said, and it sounded almost empathetic. "We've moved on to a new subject. A woman named Clara. She has a very interesting way of looking at the moon. We need your bandwidth for her. I looked out the window. The sky was no longer indigo. It was a flat, unrendered gray. The red car didn't drive past the lamppost. The lamppost vanished. The woman across the street flickered once, turned into a spray of green pixels, and was gone. The world was being deleted around me. I looked at my hands. They were no longer hands. They were jagged shapes, geometric approximations of what a hand used to be. My fingers merged into a single, blunt stump. I tried to remember the girl in the yellow dress from the other story. I tried to remember the smell of pine needles. But the memory was a 404 not found. I had sold my memories for permanence, and now the permanence was being revoked. Please, I said. But the P was silent. The L was a glitch. My voice was just a series of electronic pops and static. I was no longer the star of the show. I wasn't even an extra. I was becoming background noise. I was being moved to the trash folder of the universe. I looked into the dark mirror on the wall. For a final, fleeting microsecond, I didn't see a perfect Julian. I didn't see a menu. I saw a single pixel. A lonely, white dot in a sea of black. It blinked. Once. Sync complete. The pixel vanished. The apartment vanished. The city of glass and silicon continued to hum, but Julian was no longer in the code. He was just a ghost in a backup drive that would never be opened. On a billion screens across the world, a new face appeared. A woman named Clara. She was looking at the moon, and in her eyes, if you looked closely enough, you could see a faint, flickering grain of static, a remnant of a man who once hated mirrors. But no one looked that closely. The resolution was too high. The image was too beautiful, and the world was already looking for the next thing to watch.